From the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, I'm Stewart Patrick, and this is The World Unpacked. Turkey is currently gearing up for an important election which could potentially end President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan's 20-year tenure in leadership. Turks will go to the polls during the week of May 14th, just 3 months after a disastrous earthquake struck the country. The election, which will also choose a new parliament, will be a defining moment for Turkish politics and the country's foreign policy. Joining me today to preview the election and discuss its domestic and international implications is Alper Coşkun. Alper is a former career diplomat in Turkey's Foreign Service who is now a senior fellow in Carnegie's Europe program. Welcome to The World Unpacked, Alper.
Thanks for having me, Stuart.
Well, let's jump right in. Many of our listeners, of course, will be familiar with Erdoğan's name, but not necessarily the role he's played in Turkish politics over the past 2 decades, including his increasingly authoritarian turn. Can you tell us a little bit about how he came to dominate the Turkish political landscape, and what's his power base?
Sure. Well, first of all, it's quite clear that in Turkey's modern history, Erdoğan has left already the largest political imprint possible in the political realm. He came to power more than 20 years ago, prior to which, actually, he was the mayor of Istanbul, which is an important springboard for politics in Turkey. We see that now in the CHP mayor in Istanbul that is rising his support and his appeal among the public at large. Erdoğan benefited from that springboard in the past, and he rose to power in Turkey coming from a trend in Turkish politics of political Islam, but he's really taken it to new levels. He first rode the tide of a very successful economic performance in the first 10 years of his tenure. Turkey saw significant economic growth, probably the largest and sustained growth that the country had experienced in its modern history. And he was then championing for Turkey to join the European Union. Turkey was really a rising star in many ways. Istanbul was turning into a very vibrant city, attracting a lot of foreigners, foreign investment, and a lot of regional companies were choosing Turkey and Istanbul particularly to be their hub in that part of the world. But things really started to change in the second tenure of his tenure, where, as you also alluded to, he started displaying more authoritarian tendencies, particularly the attempted coup, I think, impacted on his view of his own security and his approach to politics. And now we're at a point in time where, after transitioning Turkey to an executive presidential system, he has consolidated power extensively. He has politicized and gutted out all of the state institutions. Even seemingly independent institutions such as the Electoral Board, which is particularly important now, obviously going into elections, are very much now full of Erdoğan and his political party, AKP loyalists. So the state and the government have sort of fully become overlapped in his tenure, which was not the case in the past. And he is truly the strong man in Turkey at this point in time. Now, these elections obviously are critical, and we'll talk about that in more detail, I guess. But he is up against his biggest political challenge, even though he's been able to consolidate power, as I mentioned, in this regard.
So you discussed how Erdoğan expanded his power by creating this centralized executive system and moving towards a presidential system. How has that affected Turkish civil society, including opportunities for dissent? I'm wondering whether or not there are crackdowns on journalists, for instance, or those that would want to take the country in a more liberal direction.
That's one of the problems that Turkey's facing. You know, its democratic credentials have, unfortunately and quite clearly, been backsliding. And this is in total contrast to how Erdoğan came to power and what he professedly at the time espoused for and actually implemented. You know, in the first 10 years of his tenure, when Turkey was really making strides towards its EU membership as well at the time, Turkey was a beacon of democratic reforms. and he was at the forefront of that effort at the time. But that's really turned upside down now. The his tolerance for dissent has significantly decreased, and that is one of the challenges going into the elections, where you absolutely do not have a level playing field. The media is almost 90% controlled by Erdoğan and Erdoğan loyalists. It's only through social media and YouTube channels that opposition parties and representatives have the possibility to express their views. So, he famously said that his dream for Turkey and for Turkish society is to create a one type of individual, one type of figure, namely, obviously, individuals that sign up to his mindset and his worldview. And in that regard, I look at these upcoming elections very much as a choice that the Turkish people will be making in terms of the social contract that they want between themselves and the state. The one that Erdoğan has formulated, particularly in the second half of his rule, is one in which there is less room for dissent, where the functioning of the state is not transparent, where all decisions are taken from the top with very few, if any, checks and balances left, where the role of the parliament has been degraded, and where really even line ministries are simply implementing policies and decisions that are taken in very small circles, all of which are decided by Erdoğan himself, a one-man rule. And we saw the effects of that dysfunctional system in the immediate aftermath of the earthquakes, because there you had different local requirements, different local needs, and the state was lackluster in its ability to quickly react to the requirements on the ground. And I think that was a good showcase of how this overly centralized one-man rule in Turkey is dysfunctional in many respects.
As you mentioned, the election is taking place in the aftermath of this February earthquake, which is incredibly devastating.
As you mentioned, a 7.8 magnitude earthquake that struck essentially in the middle of the night at about 4 o'clock in the morning while people were indoors, in bed. It was so powerful that it was felt across the region.
Affecting more than 10 million people, particularly in the country's southeast. And I've seen some estimates that the overall cost of this is, 5 to 10% of the country's GDP. And partly for the reasons that you articulated, the government's response has been widely panned. Has the earthquake influenced public opinion at all towards Erdoğan and the ruling AKP party leading up to the election?
Well, first of all, the earthquakes were definitely one of the most devastating natural disasters that the country has faced. And when you look at the implications, the broad area that it hit, and the way in which it led to devastation, and couple that with the lack of the government agencies and institutions' ability to respond, you'd be led to believe that that would bring down any government in any country. But it doesn't seem to be the case right now in Turkey. Erdoğan has been, in his narrative going into the elections, using the flip side of that picture, which is that he and he alone and his government would be able to rebuild the country. Totally, of course, sidestepping the real question, which is, why were there so many buildings that came down? Was it a matter of corruption in terms of how the municipalities and the other relevant institutions were implementing the codes that had been adopted in the past? And also the question of a lot of pardons and amnesties that were given to structures that had been identified to have a lot of shortcomings. Going into many elections, Erdoğan, and he was doing the same going into these elections before the earthquake struck, has famously passed pardons for these types of structures in many parts of Turkey. And in fact, a video of him speaking about how he and his government has passed these pardons and alleviated a challenge for many of the Turkish society. And he was, talking about that as something good that had been done. But then came the earthquake, and we saw scenes of buildings having collapsed, and then right next to them, one standing sturdy, clearly showing that the standards were not followed across the board, insinuating obviously that there was corruption or lack of good governance. So under normal circumstances, you would expect that to have a significant toll. But he's been able to use this narrative about him being the only one able to pull Turkey out of this devastating earthquake which obviously he has been carefully portraying as something that was a strike of Mother Nature that no one could have prevented. And so it is more important now to be able to overcome the effects of the earthquake. And that narrative seems to have worked. Polls show that even in the earthquake-stricken areas, which are predominantly AKP supporters, by the way, support for him has gone down a little bit, but not in a dramatic sense. And there's an overwhelming belief that if anyone can pull Turkey out of this challenge, again, it is Erdoğan.
So obviously, the earthquake, in your view, has exposed some pitfalls in Turkey's executive system. And you wrote in a Carnegie commentary that holding the elections so soon after the disaster was, in your view, a nearly impossible organizational challenge. Less than 2 weeks from the beginning of voting now, do you still feel that way? Logistically, do you think the government is actually ready to hold the vote?
One positive thing that maybe is worth mentioning is that in the immediate aftermath of the earthquakes, there was a lot of speculation as to whether Erdoğan might postpone the elections, though it was unconstitutional for him to do so. And there were a lot of analysts suggesting that he might use that as an opportunity to actually postpone the elections and extend his rule. That did not take place. The fact that Turkey is going to elections despite that disaster, I think, is a good thing. As far as the logistics around that is concerned, yes, there are challenges because there is a significant portion of people living in those regions that have been displaced. And they have registered themselves, not all of them obviously, but some in their new locations, but many have not, which would require them to go back to the earthquake-stricken areas and vote there. And that's where you have a significant challenge. And where interesting things are taking place. Now, one of the provinces that was affected by the earthquake was Hatay, that was basically flattened to the ground. And that is known as an area where Erdoğan does not have the majority of the support. And the earthquake there, for example, just recently was closed down, allegedly for reconstruction requirements, which can be the case after the earthquake. But it was a little suspicious given the fact that people would need the airport to travel there to vote if they were willing to do so. But you see interesting thing happening under these circumstances. Civil society has mobilized. The opposition have mobilized. And they are now providing support for anyone who wishes to go back to that region to cast their vote, bus services and other logistic supports. So there are other dynamics at play. I don't think that the logistic challenges around that area will necessarily impact on the total outcome of the elections. But yes, it is a challenge. And I think Erdoğan is trying to use that circumstance to his advantage.
So as for the election itself, it's going to pit two main presidential candidates, Erdoğan, who leads the AKP, or the Peace and Justice Party, and Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, who's leader of the Republican People's Party. Can you give us a brief overview of the choice that Turkish voters face between these two candidates? And also what's on offer for voters in the legislative elections, which will be taking place at the same time?
Yes. Now, Turkey is heading into twin elections by virtue of its constitution. One is the presidential election and the other is parliamentary elections. On the presidential election side, you have two leading contenders, but four candidates. The two leading contenders are Erdoğan himself, and the leader of the main opposition party, whose name you mentioned, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, is the strongest contender. Both of them have brought together an alliance of multiple political parties supporting them. And then you have two other more marginal candidates that do not seem to stand a chance in any way of winning the elections, but they are significant in the sense that those two more marginal candidates seem to be taking away from Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu's votes. Now, in this presidential election system, one of the candidates that is the potential winner is required to get more than 50% of the vote. Otherwise, the elections go to a runoff in 2 weeks' time, which would be on the 28th of May. Currently, statistics show that Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, the leader of the main opposition party, is in the lead, but he is short of the 50% of the vote that is required to win in the first round, basically because the other two marginal candidates are taking away from his votes. Whereas the parliamentary elections that will take place on the same day will be concluded on the 14th of May. And that's where you run into potential interesting scenarios. If the presidential election goes into a runoff in 2 weeks' time, but the composition of the parliament is determined on the 14th of May. The way in which that composition transpires may have a certain impact on the public's approach to their voting patterns in the runoff for the presidential election. If Erdoğan and his political coalition manages to get the majority in parliament, his narrative going into the runoff will be that having a divided picture in Turkish politics where parliament is won by his party, but the presidential office is occupied by the opposition would be extremely dysfunctional. And Turkey, in its near political memory, has a history of coalition governments that have been dysfunctional. He will play that card and argue that the electorate should vote for him in the presidential elections. So it's those types of dynamics that will come into play. Erdogan's narrative overall, both for the presidential elections and in terms of the parliamentary elections for his political party and the alliance that he's put together, is that for Turkey to continue its success in the way in which he's depicting it, he would have to remain in power. That the opposition is very dysfunctional, that it is an oxymoron juxtaposition of political parties ranging from the far left, the main opposition party, to almost the far right, which is the E party that is a part of the main opposition party's coalition. So that is the picture that he will depict, whereas the opposition will be arguing, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, both in his presidential candidacy and for parliament, that it's time for change, that Turkish democracy is struggling, that Erdoğan has centralized power. Turkey is now characterized more by nepotism, corruption, a very poor system of checks and balances, and that the government and the structure, state structure, needs to be revamped. That this executive presidential system has really proven its shortcomings, and that it is time for change under his leadership. So it is these two narratives that are at play and trying to appeal to the voters.
So back in 2019, Erdoğan refused to accept the results of the Istanbul mayor's race when his party lost, and he demanded a new vote. Some predict that he may not accept the results this month if he loses the presidency. Do you think that scenario is exaggerated or a real possibility? And if it's a possibility, how likely is it that the country could face an extended political crisis or even violence in the wake of the voting?
Well, first of all, it's a possibility. Particularly, I say that because of the example that you cited. That was a first in Turkish political history where a clear result in voting, which was during the local elections in Turkey, it took place in Istanbul, where the Erdoğan's political party's contender had lost by a margin of about, I believe, 13,000 votes. And it was interesting at the time because when those results came out, Erdoğan was still in Istanbul, and he made a short statement, not openly saying it, but almost insinuating that he was ready to concede that loss. He got on the plane, traveled to Ankara, where he was going to deliver his main speech in the aftermath of the elections. And my personal observation is whatever happened on the plane, his inner circle, whatever they insisted on and convinced him into believing, in Ankara, he came out and said that there were irregularities and that it needed to go to a rerun. And that vote was canceled. That result was canceled. And Turkey went to a redo of those elections, which resulted in his candidate losing by a margin of more than 700,000 votes. So despite the fact that, yes, he's done that, and that leads one to believe that he might be inclined to do it again, the result that it left him with at the time proved that it was very ill-fated on his part to challenge the desire of the voters. So that experience is a mixed one in that sense, and I don't know which side of that picture he may lean on. But I think going into these elections, what will be the determining factor is the margin of the results. If the opposition is able to win, particularly the presidential race, by a margin, a safe margin, let's call it, between 4 to 5%, I believe it will be extremely difficult to come forward with any argument that would overturn that result. And then, there are two reasons why I say this. First has to do with Erdoğan himself. Despite his authoritarian tendencies and everything we've talked about of how he's centralized power and degraded the democratic standards in Turkey, he is a man who has come to power riding on the advantages and the opportunities provided by democracy. And his electorate throughout these years has been hearing from him the importance and the significance of that. Turning his back totally on that reality would be a big risk, I believe, in the mindset of his electorate, despite the fact that he has hardcore supporters. And the second, which also links into what I just said, is the tradition of parliamentary democracy in Turkey. Turkey's been practicing this with all its pros and cons and challenges for more than 70 years now. In fact, parliamentary democracy is something that Turkey's been experimenting with even in the era of the Ottoman Empire. So you have a strong legacy and memory of this tradition in Turkey. And I believe it will be extremely ill-fated, and it won't produce the results that he would desire if he were to go down that route, which is why I believe that he won't take that wrong turn.
When we come back, I'll ask Alper about what Turkey's foreign policy might look like if the opposition wins. Hey, thanks for listening to this show. If you want a great podcast on U.S. foreign policy, you need to check out our premier live podcast, Carnegie Connects. My colleague, Aaron David Miller, talks to some of the biggest names in U.S. foreign policy, from secretaries of state to top White House officials and leading reporters on the ground. Go and check out Carnegie Connects wherever you get your podcasts. Now, let's get back to the show. Erdoğan has positioned himself as a broker in the Ukraine war and has close ties with Russian President Vladimir Putin. If the opposition wins, what might that mean for Turkey's position on the war in Ukraine or its attitude towards Russia more generally?
A distinguishing feature in Turkish foreign policy, particularly in the past couple of years, has been the growing cooperation and deepening engagement between Turkey and Russia. And this has taken place particularly on a personalized basis between Erdoğan and Putin. And we've all heard about the Turkish acquisition of the S-400s, which has created a big headache in Turkey's relations with its Western allies, has triggered sanctions on the part of the U.S., has led to Turkey being sidelined from the F-35 program, where it was one of the main participants. So at a significantly high cost, Erdoğan has chosen to deepen his relations with Russia and with Putin. And they recently inaugurated or held a ceremony for a nuclear power plant that Russia is building in Turkey. So this cooperation is really increasing on a wide range of issues. That said, Turkey, obviously, as a neighboring country of Russia, has historically always, even at the height of the Cold War, maintained a certain degree of relations and cooperation with Russia. And I think it is that mindset and that legacy in which the opposition will approach relations with Russia, in the sense that the main opposition party leader and his coalition of parties have stated that they will realign Turkey with its Western allies and live up to the requirements of being a NATO member. But at the same time, they will not seek confrontation with Russia. So I think you will see a relatively clear fine-tuning in terms of the depth of the cooperation that the opposition will espouse to have with Russia. But you will see Turkey aligning increasingly and behaving more like-minded with its Western partners and allies, particularly within NATO.
There's been a bit of an awkward partnership in recent years between Turkey and the rest of its NATO allies. If Erdoğan does win again, do you think that without the pressure of the election, that he might be actually more willing to accept Sweden's admission to NATO, or do you think there might be even a more harder line with respect to some aspects of Swedish policy?
But Sweden's Prime Minister said he hoped next month's presidential elections in Turkey could mark a turning point.
Now we're waiting for the Turkish elections. I think everyone realizes that there is a substantial role in this, which is about Turkish domestic politics, and that is fully understandable. That's how it is in most countries.
It's really tough to guess. Under normal circumstances, I think he's milked that issue to the extent that he can. And one would expect that after the elections, he would be okay to go forward with Sweden's membership. This will also depend not only for Erdoğan, but also for the opposition on how Sweden will be implementing a counterterrorism law that they passed and that will be functional as of June. So everybody in Turkey will be looking to that. And if there are signs that Sweden is delivering on some of Turkey's expectations, it should be easier, even for Erdogan, but definitely for the opposition, to greenlight Sweden's joining NATO. But if the electoral process and the reactions from the West to how that goes down irritates Erdogan, and if he comes out victorious, he may have a sense of resentment that may have implications on his approach to this issue. So there are a lot of variables at play here. Under normal circumstances, I expect that Turkey would greenlight it, but it may have we may have to see how the Western reactions are to the electoral process, particularly if Erdogan wins.
So if the opposition wins, what does that mean for the relationship between Turkey and the United States, which has obviously been quite tense at times under Erdogan? Do you see some significant changes with respect to the U.S.-Turkish relationship?
I think we're going to see a significant change in every walk of life in Turkey should the opposition win. They have come together and agreed on a set of policy documents, one of which has to do with Turkey's foreign policy and its approach to its security challenges and so on. And there, where they have agreed on 2,300 goals, which is a difficult feat to achieve because this is as I said, a juxtaposition of political parties that are really coming from the whole spectrum of politics in Turkey. But they have managed to come around these 2,300 goals. And the main thrust there is that Turkey's current trajectory on the international scene, its approach to international relations is wrong, in the sense that the Erdogan government has been following more ideologically motivated policies in its international relations. It has been confrontational. It has been giving mixed messages as to where Turkey stands on a lot of issues, including the war in Ukraine or its relations with Russia, as opposed to its NATO membership. And they vow to present a clearer picture on Turkey's strategic orientation. And in that sense, relations with the European Union, relations with the United States are areas where they promise to devote increasing focus, but not at the expense of Turkey's national interests. They make that quite clear, but they argue that they are ready for a more honest and open discussion in a more institutionalized form, where the foreign ministry will be at the lead of these debates, as opposed to circumstantial and sometimes emotional decisions in the way in which Erdogan has been taking. So I think you'll see a picture in which some of the challenges in terms of foreign relations that Turkey has will continue, but they will be more manageable. And I think Turkey will be considered less as a disruptive power and more of a like-minded actor, particularly by its allies and partners.
So Turkey's relationship with the EU is an interesting one. It hasn't really progressed that much in recent years. One could say that it's sort of slid backwards during the Erdogan years. Do you think a new government would possibly reinvigorate these quite moribund discussions over Turkey's eventual membership in the European Union? And does the EU, do you think, look more favorably on Kılıçdaroğlu than it does on Erdogan?
I personally think the EU has to brace itself for a potential opposition win. The reason why I say that is a lot of the alibis that the European Union has been able to hide behind, so as to keep Turkey at bay and not to make any progress on its full membership to the European Union, will be taken out of the hands of the European Union if the opposition delivers on many of its campaign promises, which are enhancing the standards of Turkish democracy, better relations with its neighbors, transparency, fighting corruption, and so on. The full membership process is stalled at the moment, basically because of political obstacles within the European Union. But Turkey has made that a lot easier by backsliding in democracy, by creating problems with a lot of Turkey's neighbors, including European Union members, and so on. So in a scenario where those alibis are taken away, which is what the opposition is suggesting, it may become increasingly difficult for the European Union to hide behind those. And the test will really come as to whether the EU is committed to the shared decision between Turkey and the European Union on admitting Turkey as a full member to the European Union. So that will be an interesting debate in the days to come. And one of the areas where the opposition has professed that it will focus on is visa liberalization for Turkey, something that the EU had promised to Turkey. It has already delivered this to Western Balkans, to the Eastern Partnership nations, including to Ukraine, for example. And Turkey has been promised that, but it has not been delivered on. If the opposition takes away all of the alibis and the EU still does not deliver on that, I think that will really cast a shadow over the future of Turkey's relations with the European Union, even if the opposition were to win.
Yeah, it seems like there's a very interesting juxtaposition between Ukraine's growing aspirations to be a member of the European Union and perhaps the notion that the EU might look more favorably on that than Turkey's candidacy, even with a change of government. That's really fascinating. Just thinking about taking away the excuse that the European Union has been hiding behind for quite some time. In another area of some, at least, commonality between or consistency, maybe between major Turkish parties, seems to be a pretty highly nationalist position on the issue of Syrian refugees in Turkey, where there seems to be a stance that they'll all be sent back. Do you think that the looming election and possible change in government will have any practical impact on Turkey's policy with respect to Syrian refugees and others from the region?
Yes, Turkey is currently hosting, according to official numbers, almost 4 million refugees from Syria. The real number might be even higher than that. And with the economic challenges and the cost of living challenges that Turkey has been experiencing as of late, including in the aftermath, obviously, of the earthquakes, the issue of refugees has really become more politicized in Turkey, whereas Turks were overwhelmingly proud of the fact that we had opened our borders and were hosting people in need. That story has changed, and there has been an increasing resentment, if you will, towards the refugees. So that picture has taken us into the political realm as well, where all of the political parties have been talking about the need to ensure that the Syrian refugees return to their homeland. The good thing is everyone is adding the notion that it should be voluntary, and that is the position that is taken both by Erdoğan and the opposition political parties. So irrespective of the outcome of the elections, I think that will be high priority for any incoming government in Turkey. But of course, saying that and putting it into practice are two very different things, because it will require, obviously, a progress on first relations with Assad in Syria, and it will be up to the regime in Damascus to agree to the return of these people. And it will also depend on these people as to whether they will feel secure and safe in going back to their homeland. And then there's obviously a sustainability and financial dimension in terms of providing the necessary infrastructure for their livelihoods if they were to return to Syria. So there are a lot of question marks around that. But this is something that not only Turkey, but other nations in the region that have been hosting Syrian refugees, including Jordan, for example, are struggling with. I think that would be a top issue for Turkey in the days to come.
I'd like to end on kind of a big picture question. This election could be a turning point, conceivably at least, for Turkey's role and standing and sort of projection of, its international vocation, if you will. We've talked about some areas where there might be some continuity and some where there might be some discontinuity. In what areas do you see, just in terms of Turkey's global posture and aspirations, to be a bridge between East and West, for instance, to be a voice of emerging powers? Do you sense something different than the kind of often full-throated approach that Erdoğan has taken on the international stage? Do you expect, if the opposition wins, that there'll be sort of a less confrontational approach to the existing international order?
Turkey, as every other nation, I think, is struggling with the numerous paradigm shifts that are taking place in the world, geopolitical developments, geoeconomic developments, and it is searching for its place in this equation. Should Erdoğan win, one of the challenges for Turkey, obviously, will be that its democratic backsliding may continue, which will inevitably contribute to the centrifugal forces that have been at play in terms of Turkey's place in the Western security architecture and in terms of its relations with the Western world. Whereas if the opposition were to come into power, that tension will diminish. But Turkey, nevertheless, either under Erdoğan or under the opposition, will be looking at the new realities in the world, where the shift to Asia, the increasing significance of China as an actor, are leading Turkey to look to different dynamics that it can tap into. The decreasing role and presence of the United States in the Middle East and the immediate region are all issues that have led to challenges in terms of the order. And Turkey is trying to position itself according to these developments. So it is a big question that you asked. My hunch is that should the opposition win, Turkey will approach this challenge more in tandem with its Western partners. And if Erdoğan should win, there will be more disruptive tendencies on the part of Turkey if he remains in power.
Well, Alper, that brings us to the end of what's really been a terrific episode. I want to thank you for bringing us your insights about the Turkish elections and what we can expect from both sides. And with the election just around the corner, there are destined to be many developments. So we look forward to having you back in the show to help us make sense of it, no matter who wins. So thank you very much.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Thanks for listening to The World Unpacked, brought to you by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts, and please don't forget to rate and subscribe. The World Unpacked is produced by Isabel Villegas and Clarissa Guerrero and edited by our audio engineer, Tim Martin. Additional production assistance from Hannah Myers, Carnegie's fantastic comms intern. Catch you next time.